With stations all over the U.S., North America, Puerto Rico, Guam, and by satellite. We are Coast to Coast AM. Connie Willis, your host, Puerto Rico. I love that. I've been binge watching Modern Family, so I'm picking up the little rolling of the R's, right? From, the one wife in there. I can't believe after watching it as long as I have, I don't know the names right offhand to throw at you, but Puerto Rico, that's fun. Anyway, it's just kind of fun to say. Hey, if you'd like to join me outside of Coast to Coast, I hope that you will. Go to ConnieWillis.com. I'm not the author. There's a famous author out there. She's at .net. I'm at .com. So I hope that you find me and you join me on the shows. Paid memberships, very private, that keeps everybody, it keeps the riffraff out when you do that, right? Keeps the riffraff out. So if you're going, hey, I don't want the riffraff, well, join my shows. It's a lot of fun, and it's a great community. Become a Blue Rocker or a cadet, and let me tell you, you'll have friends for the rest of your life. That's usually what happens. So if you'd like to do that, it's certainly worthy for you to do. ConnieWillis.com. All righty. We have got another guest coming in. We've talked a lot about the Bradshaw Ranch. You hear things about the Bradshaw Ranch. Originally, you heard a lot of things about Skinwalker Ranch. Now we got the Bradshaw Ranch. And keep in mind, I mean, from my own research, I'm a researcher. I am on the ground out there doing it, experience it. I'm about the experience of it. There's a lot of people that are all about the facts of it. There's people that are all about the science behind it. There's people that I want to capture something, I want to prove to the world, or I've been told I'm the person to prove it to the world. We have all that going on. I just want to, know what it is myself. So I go out and experience it. My personal show is to come with me and a live stream kind of thing. But my whole thing is, what is it? And to learn more and to get more and more experiences. Because if you've ever seen anything yourself, if you've ever experienced anything, and especially the scene, now some people experience and just get a vibe. Some people experience and they hear things. Some people, there's different experiences. But man, when you actually see something, and whether it's, an orb that's not dust, or if it's a strange light that's not heat lightning, maybe it's a beam of light, or you see sparkles around you, or you see an actual Bigfoot, or you see an actual alien, or an actual praying mantis, or ant people, or all these other different things out there, or some things that you cannot describe. It's hard to describe because you've never seen anything like it, and you've never even heard anybody else say that they've seen anything like it. It just changes your life, and all the things that, you thought were important before are not. To me, I wish the whole world would understand and join us on our pioneer adventures of the things that we've seen and trying to learn more and more about it, because I think the whole entire world would change. We wouldn't worry about the gossiping and the fighting and the arguing. And, that's just my whole thing about it, because then we would realize, hey, wait a minute, we need to band together as earthlings here and or just humans in general, because what are these other things? And let me tell you this too. I can't say it for every entity I've seen, but for the most part, they're much more advanced than we are. And it just puts it all in perspective. And it's something that if you've never done, I hope you get a chance to do it instead of just reading about it or just hearing about it or watching it. I hope you get a chance to experience it, and you'll be right in line with the rest of us, and you won't be arguing. You won't be yelling at us. You won't be denying us. You'll see it yourself and experience it yourself, and it's absolutely amazing. Our next guest, Jeremiah Horstman. He was born in Pennsylvania, Pennsyltucky, as us Kentuckians who live in Pennsylvania at one point call it. He had his first Bigfoot sighting at the age of 13, and we'll ask him about that at one point. He moved to Sedona. He's witnessed many paranormal moments, and he started looking at books on the local history. And then he came across Bradshaw Ranch, and he goes out there a couple times, once or twice a week. So good for him. That's very important to do. And that's where, some people have one sighting all their lives and they talk about it. But then some of us just keep having event after event after event after event. Part of it is just being out there where they are. These areas like the Bradshaw Ranch and the Skinwalker Ranch. They're all over the place. You just got to find it. There's pockets of places where there's nothing, there's no activity, and you can go out there. And a lot of people have been out in areas where there's nothing at all. You know, how many haunted houses are there? Well, most of us don't live in them, but some of us have. We have. I'm one of those people. And it was always nice to sleep and, you know, go to college, go to University of Kentucky, stay in the dorms and be free of something sitting next to your bed with you. You know, that's kind of a nice thing. You're like, wow, other people get sleep at night. So these things are everywhere, but there's also plenty of places that they're not there. And a lot of you are in those places where they're not. So I know that you deny a lot of us that are in the places that are. But when you have been in the places that do have things, you start wanting to know more and you find where the others are. And then they're like magnets to you. And I believe that's what's going on with Jeremiah Horstman. And I believe your girlfriend as well also experiences these things with you. So first of all, first time guest here on Coast to Coast. Welcome, Jeremiah, to Coast to Coast. How are you?
Doing well, Connie. Good morning. How are you?
Oh, I guess it is good morning, isn't it? You know, not until I wake up is it morning.
Same here. Same here. It's good
So
to be
how?
on.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. You've had your experiences along the way, but you do all sorts of other things. So before we get into the Bradshaw Ranch and what your experiences are, give a little bit more background about you, because I mean, it was interesting when I was first given your name by Tom D'Ongio. I call him D'Ongio, Tom Dongo, who of course talked to us before about the Bradshaw Ranch. I went and saw your website and I'm like, man, this dude, holy cow, you have all this army fatigue and all this other stuff on, but you actually do reenactments, right?
That's correct. My hobby since I was in my youth was Civil War reenacting and World War II reenacting, and that what preceded that was a competitive rifle team, and that was my mother trying to get me to stay out of trouble. She wanted me to have a hobby that right away taught me responsibility and put me around more adults, because my father died when I was very young from Agent Orange, and I didn't have a father figure. And what the hobbies brought to me were a lot of really excellent father figures who kind of took me under their wing and gave me a little bit of guidance, and ultimately too, right up to current times, because I still occasionally do the World War II reenacting. It's given me the best friends I've ever had in my life, really good people. And in fact, some of whom are also experiencers in the subject at hand that we're about to get into. So it's really been, for me, a great hobby, a hobby that one would lead to another. And then collecting. Just like with any collector in the world, when you start to collect things, you say, well, this is the last thing I'm going to buy. Oh, wait, there's something else I want. You start buying more and more. It never stops.
Never. No way. It's just, it's that addiction. Were you ever in the military at all?
I was not. I have not been. The closest thing to it has been reenacting. The Civil War reenacting unit that I belonged to, luckily, had a lot of non-commissioned officers and the commanding officer who had actually been in the military. And so we did these, what reenactors call full immersion events, which is it's as close to being in the field as possible. You sleep on the ground. You have what's called first call, which is when a first sergeant wakes everyone up. You have weapons inspections, all those things. And so that also gave me a little bit of a militaristic perspective on things and a discipline. It also brought a lot of discipline, because when we goofed up, we got yelled at. When we made a mistake, we were what the Army calls gigged or punished for it. And that, to me, was also kind of integral in getting me more discipline in my youth. And I really appreciate a lot of the things I learned with the reenactors. But it started with the Civil War reenacting. I saw Gettysburg for the first time when I was 5. And my mother, who liked to put things in perspective visually, as a 5-year-old, I couldn't really comprehend, and I had my twin brother with me, what had happened there. And so she was giving us a visual of the battlefield and the visual of, for instance, Pickett's charge, and trying to have my brother and I imagine what it looked like to see 15,000 men in gray across a mile of open field. And in doing that, I was so awestruck, even as a 5-year-old. I wanted to know more. I was inspired, and I wanted to know as much as I could. And she would say, "Well, boys, we'll get you some books, and we'll read some books to you." And she did that. And so that gave me even more perspective on history. And that, too, just like collecting, is something you just can't get enough of. You want to know more. You want more information. You want more background. And so as I grew older, when a lot of my friends were out doing things that young boys do, I was buying books and reading history books, and it wasn't just about the Civil War, about other periods in history. Growing up in that part of Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh area, the French Indian War is prominent in that area, so I bought books on the French Indian War. But one thing in the back of my mind that was also very interesting was mystery, the great mystery of life. Where do we come from? Who put us here? Why are we here? And so I would buy books on those, too. And I remember my mother used to get the Time Life series of books, which she had a lot of the history ones, World War II, Civil War. But she got one that was about mysteries. And I think there was probably 30 volumes. I can't remember how many for certain, but they had ones on the paranormal. They had ones on ghosts. They had ones on cryptids, and I couldn't stop reading those. They were fascinating to me. Never would have thought that within years of reading those that I'd have my own experience, which started in southwestern Pennsylvania, my hometown, Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, which I moved to shortly after my father passed away. My grandmother was very sentimental, and she wouldn't leave her house to move to our farm. And so we left our farm and left the dairy country and moved to the suburb of this small town called Canonsburg, which is Perry Como's hometown. It was the only thing really that put us on the map at the time.
That's a big deal. That's a big deal.
Actually, Bobby Vinton, too. It's also Bobby Vinton's hometown.
Don't forget Bobby. Yeah, I actually met him before, at least, so that was kind of cool.
Perry Como. Perry Como's that chief crooner for us. And really, that became my hometown. I was there from the age of 4 up to 22 when we moved away. And my grandmother lived in a big old house. It was built in the 1920s. I think it was finished in 1929. And it was in a kind of peculiar place just outside of Canonsburg on a road that was not really, you wouldn't really call it suburb for that time. It was, the houses had a lot of space in between them. To the rear of it, over a 5-acre portion of property, was a Black Angus farm, a railroad cut between the Black Angus farm and her backyard, which figures prominently in what I'm going to tell you. It had a belt of forest around it, and it sat in a deep ravine. I think it was the second oldest railroad in the country, so Chartiers-Houston Railroad. It wasn't very long. It was only 32 kilometers long. And across the street from that, another farm on a forested hill. And in 1991, my mother worked as a psych nurse at Mayview State Hospital. Her bedroom, because my grandmother was living in the house and she was very private, she wanted most of the house to herself, she agreed that the first floor would be ours. And so we were basically living on the first floor of this massive house. I think it had about 22 rooms, stained glass windows, oak floors. It was a beautiful home. And so she had most of it, and we lived comfortably on the first floor. The bedroom that my mother chose had been an atrium, which had windows all the way around it. And it was on the east side of the house. And the only street light was on the corner of that side of the house. Across the street, a small belt of forest, through that a field, and then up a hill to a farmhouse. Now, we had a lot of dogs at the time. We always had our farm dogs and farm cats. And that particular late summer was very humid and very muggy. That part of Pennsylvania, anyways, is always very humid and muggy in the summers. But we had a particularly muggy summer. And a lot of very violent lightning storms. That I remember specifically about it. And one night, my mother was awoke to our dogs going wild. They were barking, growling, snarling. in a very unusual way. It wasn't like them to do that, and they were barking at the windows along the east side of the house, along the atrium, which she had made her bedroom. So she got up and she looked outside, and she couldn't see anything, just the muggy haze of moisture around the street light on the corner. Got the dogs to settle down, tried to go back to bed. Now, this reoccurred over a period of several nights. And I think it was on the third or fourth night when the dogs were doing just the same. They were barking at the windows. She saw a tall shadow racing past the windows. It was very tall. That part of the house was up high anyway, where the windows were. Anything to cast a shadow up against those windows from between the street light and those windows had to be considerably tall, though she didn't actually think about that just yet. So the next day, she asked my brother and I, did you hear anything last night? And I said, no, I didn't. She said, did you hear the dogs barking? I was a heavy sleeper, and I was on the other side of the house. I said, no, I don't remember hearing anything. Why? And she said, well, I think somebody's running through the yard, maybe a prowler or something. Something's really disturbing the dogs. So she said, I want you boys to just be sure to lock the door, be on the lookout. If somebody shady shows up at the door, don't let them in during the day when I'm not here. And so we said, yeah, that's fine, and kind of put it in the back of our minds. And it happened again. Something running through the yard in the middle of the night woke the dogs up. They were going wild. She tried to let the dogs outside. We had an enclosure in the back from the back door, and the dogs refused to go outside.
We got about a minute just to let you know.
Sure. And when the dogs refused to go outside, she knew that something out of the ordinary was up, because they would always go outside, through the back door to our enclosure. And so from that point, she wanted to talk to us again, because she knew that something was very different. Something was up. And she sat my brother and I down and decided to kind of brainstorm on what's going on, because the dogs were not usually that upset, especially that often, and we certainly weren't prone in that neighborhood to having prowlers.
So we're going to leave it as a cliffhanger here, because we got to go. We don't want to rush the story. We want to find out what he saw or they saw or what happened after that. Stay with us. Connie Willis here on Coast to Coast AM. Another very interesting show here on Coast to Coast AM, the real theater of the mind. It's Connie Willis here with you, enjoying the evening. Fall is here. Oh my gosh, I went picked up some stuff to grill today. Walked up, thought, what am I going to get? As I walk into the store, there's a bazillion different pumpkins. I loved it. It was awesome. And they were the just beautiful pumpkins, ready to become a jack-o'-lantern or a jacky-lantern or whatever you want to call your o-lantern. And then they had the ones that have all the little, different like blisters on them. And then there were white ones and there were green ones and like green and white ones, just wonderful. And the best of all, which is something that you must get when you get a pumpkin. It is a must. And you will find stores that don't have this, and it's ridiculous. Maybe they're just the ones that are left over. Maybe I wait too late, maybe a day or the day of Halloween when this happens. But they had, the handle on the top, the stem. They had the stem. That's the handle. You got to have a stem. And there are some people that will sell pumpkins without the stem. It is so wrong. You need that, right? It's a very important part of the entire look of it and the character of it and that handle that you need. So all these beautiful stems. And in fact, when the stems are a little longer and they curl up and you can just really, go to town with that kind of decoration and that kind of look. So a lot of fun, but it was good to see those things. So fall is in the air, Halloween coming up, and just, 'tis the season, right? Love it, love it, love it. Let's go to our guest, Jeremiah Horseman. He was telling us, Jeremiah, you were right in the middle of the climax part where I think it was your mom telling us the story of setting you and your brothers and sister down to see what was going on, what was happening, to talk about it?
Yes. We sat down for the second time to discuss what was running by the windows at night. This time was a little different. She had a little bit more of a serious look on her face. And she said, tried to let the dogs out, and they wouldn't go out. And she said there was a smell in the air. It was a very heavy smell of a sulfurous, maybe a trash smell, a rotting smell. And I think something else is going on here, because right before I tried to let the dogs out, this time in seeing this shadow running past the windows, she said whatever it was making a noise. And I remember looking at my brother like, what is she getting at? What is she talking about? And she said the noise was like a grumbling sound. It was something that was irritated. It was upset because the dogs were barking and growling and snarling. She said it was making this grumbling sound as it ran. And she said I could actually hear, this time, individual footfalls. It was something really big, really heavy, and she was very certain it was bipedal. And so, again, my brother and I were looking at each other like, what is she talking about? She said, I'm really worried that we have a very large prowler and that there might be somebody that's mentally ill. So I want you boys to be on the extra alert. And she reminded us again, when she's not there, don't answer the door for strangers and so on. We're both 13 years old, so we're thinking, oh please, we're not worried about somebody coming to the door. We know what to do. So fast forward maybe a week or so, and I had a chiropractor appointment. And as I'm waiting for my chiropractor, there was a magazine. It may have been the Pittsburgh magazine. I can't remember which now. And the feature article was about Stan Gordon's group, PASU, the Pennsylvania Association for the Study of the Unexplained. And I flipped to that page where the story started and read an incredible story about the Kecksburg UFO crash, which I'd never even heard of. And I lived a short distance from Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, and how it inspired Stan Gordon to start his organization. In it, it talked about his investigators looking into things such as poltergeist activity, UFO sightings, UFO abductions, and Bigfoot sightings. And it stressed that there were a lot of Bigfoot reports that year. And then it went into describing the signs that people had Bigfoot in their area. And my heart started to beat really rapidly, because as I was reading the article, it was describing more or less the same things that my mother just described. Strange sounds at night. It was describing the kind of putrid smell that comes with these creatures. And then it had, I think they'd set up a 1-800 number that you could call. And so I remember after reading the article, I was thinking to myself, I wonder if that's what's going through our yard. That's actually pretty frightening. And so I went home and I wrote down the number. And without even consulting with my mother or telling my brother about it, I went ahead and called the group of Stan Gordon's, this PASU. And I talked to one of the people at PASU. I described to them what my mother had been experiencing. I described the smell. And they said they would have one of their investigators call back. And in a short period later, they did have a investigator of theirs who called back, a man named John, and he wanted me to re-describe what my mother had experienced. He asked if she was there, if he could talk to her, and I said no, she's at work right now. She works at the state hospital. She's a psych nurse. And he said, okay. He mentioned a weekend. He said, you boys are probably in school now, and I'd like to catch you, obviously, when you're home, so I have somebody to show me around, and I just want us to show up on property. He said, be certain to have your mother call me so she knows what's going on. Well, I didn't. I didn't bother mentioning to her until virtually the last minute that these strangers are coming, and she was a bit upset with me. She said, who is coming? I described to her the article that I read, described to her how they virtually had every detail of what she was describing, the making like gurgling sounds, screeching sounds, the bad smell. And so she was a bit upset with me at first for calling these guys. But I think within hours of them showing up, she realized these are staunch professionals. They were really incredible guys. The group that Stan had, they had mostly professors. Some of them were high school professors, and some of them were college professors, chemists, and engineers, and so on. And the two guys that they sent were both also experiencers themselves. John and Devin were the first two guys I met. I remember Devin was a huge man. He was like 6'5", with a big red beard. And they asked me to show them where this being or whatever was leaving the shadow up against the house who had been running. So I took them there, and I remember they paid particular attention to the fact that we had a huge, mature apple orchard to the rear of the house on the north end of the property. And they kept mentioning, oh, there's another apple tree. And I remember asking what makes the apple trees a part of this. And they said, well, one of the things that tends to attract these creatures are apples, especially very sweet apples, and you've got that here. They said another thing is you have this railroad that runs through the forest behind your house. They said these creatures tend to use railroads to get from point A to point B. And they said we noticed on the map before we got here, a short distance away is the Chartiers Creek. They also tend to be near to bodies of water, and you have all three of those here. The next thing they asked, they said, do you have any old mines or caves here? I said, we sure do. There's several coal mines nearby. There was the old Hendersonville coal mine patch just a short distance away. And so they seemed to nod, and I said, what's that? What does that have to do with it? And they said, that's another thing that tends to be a quality in common with areas where Bigfoot sightings are. And my curiosity then piqued. I said, do you have other calls of other people having the same sort of thing going on here? And they both looked at each other, and they said, we do, but those are what we call silent cases, which is when people don't want to be identified and they don't want their exact location to be divulged. I said, oh, that's fascinating. And so I'm picking their brains. I think I got to be annoying to them because they're trying to concentrate on searching the property for footprints and so on. And I'm assaulting them with questions about Bigfoot sightings. And I remember we got to the absolute rear of the property, right before the belt of forest, which the Chartiers Valley Railroad cuts through. And I remember the big man, Devin, with the red beard, shouting out to John, John, come here. And I started to walk over to it. He put his hand up and with a very stern voice. He said, you, stop. So I did. And he was pointing at the ground and whispering something. And then they both looked at me. And John walked over and he said, now, listen, he said, I'm not much for pranksters. He said, you wouldn't be pulling my chain if you and your brother were making anything up and leaving footprints about, would you? And I said, no, why? And he said, we just found a set of very deep footprints at the edge of your garden going into the forest. And he said, we don't have time for pranksters. And he said, you mentioned that you love to watch movies, you love thrillers and so on. And he said, you wouldn't be pulling our chain, would you? And I said, no, absolutely not. And I said, in fact, this is my mother's bag. My mother's the one that saw these shadows. I haven't seen anything of them yet. He said, all right. And he said, come here, I want to show you something. So they walked me over to the forest belt, which was on the north end of the property. And sure enough, there was a set of very deep footprints from the edge of our garden into the forest. And I was shocked. It was something I hadn't seen before. I hadn't noticed that. And we spent a lot of time walking the railroad. We had our own little path that went down through that patch of forest onto the railroad. And as kids, that's where we spent a lot of our time. And my mind was spinning. I had so many thoughts about what was going on. But they asked us if they could come back. And by this time, my mother's down there looking at the footprints. She also is shocked because she was a tomboy growing up. She was always out in the forest. She was a hunter. She was always hunting. And so she thought she knew the Pennsylvania forest really well. She had seen some spooky things in her youth while hunting, but never anything like this. And so she said, sure, you can come back whenever you like. And he said, what we do, we call them stakeouts. He said, John introduced himself as a master chess player. He went through all these different chess competitions. He said, I can sit still without moving for hours. He said, I'm going to find a place on your property where I can observe. He said, probably in the apple orchard or watching the apple orchard. And I'll place myself. And he said, I'm going to pick a position for my colleague, Devin, where we can, just between the two of us, triangulate a good view of this area where this creature has been running through. And he said, I need to tell you, too, I think there's more than one creature. And that made all of us, we kind of were taken back by that, and our eyes went really wide. And my mother said, what makes you think that? He said, the set of tracks we found, there's actually two different measurements. So that's indicative of two different creatures that have been passing through here. So I think there's at least two. And we were all just kind of speechless about that. So they came back, I think, a week later, and John got up into a tree, one of our apple trees. It was a very mature apple orchard. And Devin was on the ground, and they had voice-activated headsets so they could talk to each other. And they asked if I would go out with them. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I wasn't going to miss this. Devin was supposed to be mobile. And he said, I don't know this area so well. I need you to show me where things are. He said, if there's a fence that we might trip over, a wire, I want to know where it's at. And he said, generally just need to count on you to be quiet. He said, if you can be quiet and do as you're told, I'll give you a flashlight. But he said, do not turn it on unless I tell you to. And I said, that's fine. So this gets to be September, late September of 1991. And this particular September of 1991, there had just been, it was the 21st. There had been a lot of thunderstorms, and it was extremely humid and muggy for September in Pennsylvania, usually cooling off by that time, but I remember it was very hot. And I remember the man in charge, John, had asked me to take Devin down to the railroad tracks. And he said, what I want you to do is just to be mobile, and I want you to go back and forth on these railroad tracks. And he said, if you hear anything, see anything, smell anything, report back to me. And he said, and otherwise, I'll call you with further instructions. And these headsets were loud. At the time, I had good hearing. I could actually hear them talking to each other over the headset. Now I couldn't hope to, because with the reenacting hobby, I've got tinnitus, so my hearing's very bad. But I remember as it got dark, we had gone back and forth a number of times, and I think Devin was getting agitated and antsy and wanted to move up to where he believed the action would be. And I remember he asked John if we could return to the property. And John said, no, I'd like you to stay down there and keep going back and forth. So we were coming back from a trestle with the Chartiers Creek under it, walking toward our property. And the trees that were in the forest belt with which the Chartiers Railroad goes through are so thick and they intertwine over the top. It makes more or less a tunnel or a canopy over that area. So even with any starlight or moonlight, it's pitch black. And this man wouldn't let me turn a flashlight on, so I'm stumbling over railroad ties. And at that time, I'm hungry and tired, and I don't think anything's going to happen. I think I'm never going to see anything. And suddenly, we heard movement to our upper left, which was on the same side as our property. But we weren't quite behind our property yet. And the man put his hand out and stopped me from walking. And I started to ask him, what is it? And he went, shh. He shushed me. And I remember my heart started to race. And then suddenly there was a crash right in front of us, and a huge boulder was thrown down on the railroad tracks in front of us. And there was just enough light that we could see that the boulder was very big. And it shattered. Part of it had hit the iron rails. And it had shattered, made this massive ringing sound. And then the dust from the boulder shattering was all around us. And then suddenly we could smell this really horrific, awful, sulfurous smell that almost smelled like a rotting smell as well. Once you smell it, you never forget that smell. And again, my heart's racing. I'm frightened, and I have no recollection of this. But the other man that was in charge, John, said he could actually hear me screaming over the headset. Although I don't actually recall screaming out of fright. I don't doubt that I did, but I actually don't remember screaming, because several more boulders landed right in front of us. It was as if something was telling us not to go any farther by throwing boulders in front of us. It was trying to scare us away. So we stood still after I think the third boulder came down. And again, part of that had hit the rails and shattered. And there was this dust around us. And Devin asked for permission from John to turn lights on, which John said yes. So we turned on our lights. And we're looking around, and I'm thinking to myself, this is incredible. There's something really powerful up there throwing boulders. And this is definitely something more strong than man, to be able to heave these boulders, because you could also hear them crashing through the tree branches up above. Now, the ravine that we were in is very deep. They had to actually blast when they were making that railroad to get the grading level down to where it had to be. So there was a cliff, more or less, on both sides. And out of that cliff were these massive bits of rock and different types of rock. And that's where whatever this was pulling these boulders out. And we were shining our lights, I remember, up on the embankment. And we could see where something had ripped out freshly rock and heaved them down upon the railroad tracks in front of us, but we couldn't see anything there. So after, I don't know how much time had transpired. It seemed like forever to me at the time because I was so frightened, and my adrenaline by this time was going, that the man told me to turn off my flashlight, which I did. And he was standing very still, staring at that embankment. And then again, I remember he grabbed my shoulder and said, "Stay still." And he was looking up there, and I remember he said, "John, I see two silhouettes. There's two of them." And I remember John saying over again, "Keep your eye on them. Are they moving?" And he said, "No, they're staring at me." And I got really scared at that point. And I guess they said again later, as we were recollecting what happened that night, that I started to whimper or scream again, which I have no recollection of. And he said, "John, they're moving. They're moving." And John said, "Which way?" He said, "I think they're coming toward you." And so John said, "I want you to come double back and come up through the backyards and hug the tree line." And Devin said, "Affirmative." And he grabbed me again and pulled me away. So now we're coming back away from where these creatures are.
And when we come back, we'll find out exactly what happened. Then we'll get into the Bradshaw Ranch and his experiences there. Stay with me. It is Jeremiah Horseman and myself, Connie Willis, here on Coast to Coast AM.